Hi everyone, it's Plastic EP here in Melbourne, Australia. I got my very special guest here, Michael Hill, to talk about his fantastic book on John Lennon. How are you today, Michael?
Going well, thanks Plastics. Good to have the interview with you.
And your book, if you can just tell me a little bit about that.
Okay, the book is probably the best available account of John Lennon as a boy. It's John Lennon in his formative years, starting from when the book starts from when he was born, but I first met him at age 5, and we were 12 years through school together, mostly in the same class. And when we were aged 15, 16, we were really close. And we were like 4 best friends at school, John and his best friend, me and my best friend. And those twos made a 4. So we spent a lot of time together. And it was in that group of 4 that John heard most of his early music at my house, because I was the one who had the record player. I was the one who earned money from delivering newspapers, starting from age 14, and I bought records. John had no record player, no records, and very little exposure to music. So he started with me with pop music and progressing through even listening to traditional jazz, and then through Hank Williams. I really got him hooked on Hank Williams, quite amazing. And then with skiffle with Lonnie Donegan, and going into rock and roll with Bill Haley. Elvis, of course. Elvis he had heard of it, and he got pretty besotted with Elvis until I turned him onto somebody who I told him was a lot better than Elvis. And that's really the pivotal, essential story of my book. It's the book's available on the web. Well, you can get it from Amazon, but the best place to get it is from the book's website, johnlennonlegend.com, and you get a signed original copy. I'd like to talk about this print, which was a gift to me from the artist Eric Cash, who's a great artist for the Beatles. John Lennon, I think, is a great likeness of John Lennon, and he let me use this in my book, and he also designed the cover for my book. It's well worth looking up Eric Cash and looking at other prints that he has, like when Lennon met McCartney. He's done prints like John Lennon's bedroom. He's done paintings of pivotal moments in John's life, or things of significance in John's life. This is my copy. The original was sold at Sotheby's auction a few years ago, so this is a copy of the whole school photo taken a couple of months, 2 months before we left school, 1957, and the famous section with John Lennon in is here, with Pete Shotton, John Lennon, Don Beatty, and me, Mike Hill, and that's the one that's photographed. It appears on the front cover of. This is the only other whole school photo that was taken during the 5 years that we were together at Quarrybank High School. So this was taken 2 years before the other one, 1955. And it's a summer photograph. And here is John Lennon, Pete Shotton next to him, and another guy, and then it's me. So we're all in the same group. It's significant when you look, if you compare them carefully, you'll see the difference in hairstyles, because by 1957 we're all trying to copy the teddy boy look, and with the long hair and the what we call the DA at the back, which is a duck's arse for people that don't know. So you had your hair very thick around the side and folded in at the back in a DA. This is part of the only other whole school photo that was taken during the 5 years that we were together at the school. This one was taken just before we left the school, 1957, and you can see John Lennon trying to look like a teddy boy. He's got his hair standing up. He's got his tie very narrow with a Windsor knot, and his best friend Pete Shotton is at his side, and my best friend Don Beattie were laughing at a joke that John had told. He was very good at telling a joke and saying something sarcastic usually. Then he'd have a straight face, and people around him would be cracking up, particularly Pete Shotton. So it was often Pete who got in trouble, and this was me here. So those are the two twos that made a four. I have a collection of Beatle books, by no means comprehensive. You fill a whole bookcase to do that, but some are my favourites. One of the interesting books for me was this book that I bought many years ago in Liverpool, and this is a book by John Lennon's closest friend, Pete Shotton, and it's what I call the unexpurgated version of the John Lennon story. It's a little bit exaggerated, but I read it and I found it fascinating. He confirms in this book my pivotal role in turning John Lennon on to rock and roll. And this was the first vindication I had independently of what I told a few people, and I'm not sure that they ever believed me. But this book was, it put a lot of stuff in here that I wouldn't want my children to read. So when I'd read it, I hid it away. I didn't want my teenage children to read it. But it's a good book. And I finally, many years later, in 2003, got to meet Pete Shotton when he was living in Dublin and Ireland. And I took this book with me. We had a really good reunion. And he wrote in, I took this book, he wrote in here to my old schoolmate Michael Hill, fond memories, Pete Shotton. So I really treasure that. And Pete sadly died in the last couple of years. But that's not easy to get hold of. But that would be one that really meant something to me. My books are, well, a lot of books, the Beatle books are just at the end here. Including Mark Lewison's, probably the best one.
Michael, I'd just ask you, the first time you saw Paul and John Lennon rehearsing, I believe it was at Paul's house. If you could tell me a little bit about that, and that was what? What was the address there?
That was Forthland Road. This was a very small house, a council house, or what in Australia would call a housing commission. And it's now open, belongs to the National Trust. And you go into the room, and of course it's a very small room. But just going back slightly, a famous point in the story of the evolution of the Beatles is the famous meeting of Paul McCartney when he first meets John Lennon through the introduction of Ivan Vaughan, who'd been at primary school with us. I missed that meeting. We'd just finished school in July 1957. I'd already started working. I guess we were moving away from each other. I was seriously working and trying to build a career, and John Lennon was still fooling around as he did for the next 3 years when he went to art school. So this was before this was in the school holidays, and they played in I think late July. Anyway, they played in Woolton at this Church Fete, and I didn't go to that. I didn't know about it. I didn't go. So I hadn't at that point met Paul McCartney. But I guess probably a couple of years later, it's very strange because John went to the art school, and by one of these extraordinary things that happen in life, the school where Paul McCartney was there, and he was 1 year younger than John, so, and then he stayed on at school to do his higher certificate. So he was at the grammar school, the Liverpool Institute, for the next 3 years that John Lennon, the same 3 years that John was at art school. So they were next door to each other. And they used to, meet at lunchtimes. And it was, I guess, probably about, we would have been about 18. So I was already working, and it must have been a weekend because I went over with Don Beattie. We went on our bikes, and he said, "Come, we're going to see John and Paul." That's the first time I saw them. So I wouldn't say it was the Beatles rehearsing, it was the three. Because the Beatles was really only three players, so this was then the original players apart from John had dropped out. So there was John and Paul was in. Paul brought George Harrison in. So when I say we saw them rehearsing, it was those three they were rehearsing in Paul's house, which they often did. So Paul's house was very different from John's, and they were able to go there. By that stage, Paul's mother had died, John's mother had died as well, gave them a bond. And I think the father, I didn't meet the father, he must have been out somewhere. So we stood in the doorway of the room, and there were a few other people there. So I didn't get to talk really to Paul or to George, but I got kind of pretty close up to them. The next time I saw them was when after they were suddenly pulled out. I mean, this trip to Hamburg was a real life changer. John was towards the end of his art school. He would have failed because he never passed any exams, but he never finished the 3-year course. And Paul McCartney never finished his 2 years in the senior school to do his final exams to go to university, because they gave all that up. They were given the opportunity to go to Hamburg, which they did, and they had kind of a baptism of fire over there, and they played and played and played. And they came back as a really hard rock and roll group, and they came back and made a huge impact in Liverpool. They already had a following before they went, but when they came back, wow, they kind of pretty quickly went to the top of the groups. There were quite a few groups in Liverpool. This is what I call the Boys on the Beach photograph, and photographs of John Lennon as a child are very rare, and this one suddenly appeared out of the blue in the year 2000, and it really triggered, it's more than anything what triggered me to start writing my book. And it shows John Lennon, Jimmy Tarbuck, who went on to become a famous comedian and golfer in the UK, me just over here. And this was Ivan Vaughan, who 5 years after this photo was the boy who introduced John Lennon to Paul McCartney. Very significant. So when this photograph, if you want to have a look at it, when the photograph suddenly appeared, it appeared in the Daily Mirror and then the next day in the Daily Mail. And they did a write-up, and they found out who all these boys were and did a write-up on each of them. This is just a copy from an extract from the whole school photograph, which I used in my book. So that's the 4. So what happened as we were growing up together, I mean, John's closest friend, they were inseparable, was Pete Shot, and my closest friend was Don Beattie. Like the 2 2s made a 4. And the 4 of us used to go pretty regularly down to my house from school when we were not supposed to be out of school, but we'd duck down on the bikes and play records, smoke a cigarette, have some fish and chips. And this was where John had his, what he looked back on as a pivotal moment in his life, when he knew suddenly what he wanted to do with his life, and when he became a musician, because up to the age of 15 he showed no interest. And he had little knowledge of music, and in the house where he was living with his aunt and uncle, they had no record player. There was very little music on the radio, pop music. So most of the early music that John heard was actually at my house, because I was the one buying the records, and I had the radiogram. And in my book, we tell how it came about that from these 4 friends, 3 of us went. At age 15, we went together to Amsterdam on a school exchange, and John didn't come for reasons we don't know. Probably wasn't allowed to go because he was behaving pretty badly at that stage. And I found a record in a shop in Amsterdam which had just been released. We discovered later, only released 1 or 2 days before. And I took it back to England, and it wasn't released in England for about another 10 months. So I probably had the only copy in the country. And I played this record to the other 3 at my house a few days after we got back. And the record was Little Richard's Long Tall Sally, and the B-side Slippin' and Slidin'. And when we played the record, we all looked to John to get his reaction, because we kind of looked to him as the leader. He always had an opinion on everything. And he was silent. And we couldn't believe it. He was literally didn't know what to say. He was stuck for words. and it was Pete Shotton who spoke, and he said, I think it was Negro singing, which is pretty clever because I hadn't told them anything about the record or the singer or anything at all. And John said, funnily, oh, I didn't know Negroes could sing, which sounds a stupid thing to say, but he'd never heard the black blues singers. And all the singers he knew, from Elvis Presley, Bill Haley, and Lonnie Donegan, and all the pop singers, Johnny Ray and Frankie Lane, they're all white. So we then played the other side, Slippin' and Slidin'. And 6 weeks after this, John bought his first guitar, and he suddenly knew what he wanted to do with his life. And he looked back on that, and when he was interviewed, how did he get into rock and roll? He went back to that moment, and he said that's what changed his whole life. And so up to that point he was infatuated with Elvis. And I told him, before I played this record, I said, I've got a record by a guy I think's better than Elvis Presley. And of course he didn't believe me, but that was to get his attention, which it did. And he believed me afterwards.
Okay.
Yes, these photographs are not particularly in date order, but when we were aged 15, from the 4 friends, 3 of us, myself here, Pete Shotton, Don Beattie, went to Amsterdam on a school exchange. 60 boys and girls went from Liverpool. We paired off with Dutch children. So this was taken in Holland. This was a teacher. The pity John didn't go. He would have enjoyed it. This teacher was one of the few teachers who really supported John Lennon. And I think it was through his influence that John got into art school for 3 years, even though he never passed the school exam in art. So this was the trip on which I bought the record that turned out to be the turning point in John Lennon's life, Little Richard's Long Tall Sally. And when I went to England, this was a Tim Holmes here's Tim Holmes at age 11 or 10, and here's Tim Holmes on his 65th birthday. The reason I'm showing you this one is this is Julia Bird, who's John Lennon's half-sister, and she was writing her own book. And she asked for my help in writing that book and Tim's help because she really didn't know. She particularly wanted to know about John at grammar school. She was 7 years younger than John, which is a big difference if you're only 10 or 11 when your brother's 17. So I was able to help her with her book. That's Julia Baird, B-A-I-R-D. And her book came out a few years later, and then it was made into a movie, which some people will have seen, called Nowhere Boy, which I enjoyed. She didn't like it, but I liked it. So Julia Baird. John Lennon's house, of course, which people who've been to Liverpool will have been to that. And John Lennon's, this was his bedroom, which was very similar to his house and mine are almost the same, semi-detached, so 2 houses forming one building. And he had the small bedroom over the front door, which was where mine was. So I could very much relate to that. When I knew John as a child, I never got into the house. His Aunt Mimi was not very keen on scruffy boys coming into the house, so I think Pete Shotton got in. I remember Paul McCartney said he never got in either. So, but I got in like a lot of people get in now because it's a National Trust property and you can go in on a National Trust tour. Strongly recommended. Takes you to John's house and Paul's house. So that was pretty interesting for me. When I got in the house and the guide was talking, and on the wall in the kitchen when he was talking was this whole school photograph, and of course he didn't have any idea that I was in that photograph, which I was able to tell him at the end of the tour. So he was pretty interested in that. Okay, that's about. Oh, this was the. This was a small photo which is in the book. This is the back of my house, and this is where we used to get together and play our records in the back lounge room. So that's kind of significant in the story of John Lennon. These are some of my photos, most of which appear in the book. But photos of John Lennon as a child are extremely rare, and the ones that are out there are well known. One that was never known about and never published was this one. This is a copy, the original size. This was a school photograph taken when we were in the infants, co-educational, at Dovedale Road Primary School. And John Lennon is, how could I have a look? John Lennon is here. And this was me, Bob Hayes next to me. I was the tallest boy in the school. We're standing in front of an air raid shelter, so this was only 2 years. This was 1947, 2 years after the end of the Second World War. And we still had the shelters which were built when the bombs were falling. So to give some protection, so we never used them because when we started school, the war had just finished. So that's a slightly bigger copy of the same photograph with John Lennon looking fairly angelic. He wasn't angelic, but he looked fairly angelic in that photo. And I stood out. I was the tallest boy in the school. So that's the very early photograph. And then when we got into the boys only. So this is a junior section of the school. So this photograph is fairly well known. That's John on the back row. And this is me over here. And Bob Hayes next to him. And my friend Don Beattie was here. So not long after this photo was taken, we sat for an exam. And if you passed the exam, you could go to grammar school. If not, you didn't. You went to a secondary modern school. So John passed, I passed, Bob Hayes passed, Don Beattie passed, and we all went to the same school, which was this school, Quarry Bank. This is the school magazine. This was the original building when it was a private house that became Quarry Bank High School for Boys. So this was the school that we went to, 650 pupils, boys only. So we were boys only from the age of about 7 onwards. And there were 2 photographs taken at the school. And this is part of the photograph that was taken in 1955. I don't know how we got so close to the headmaster, but that was the headmaster here. And this is me right behind. And Pete Shopton, John's best friend, and here's John himself. So that was 1955. And then 1957, for people who are interested in the story of John Lennon, and I guess you are or you wouldn't be watching this video, this is nothing to do with me really, but I recommend people to get themselves a copy of this documentary, which you can get by going to amazon.co.uk or amazon.com, and you just type in "looking for Lennon," and it's a documentary. David Bedford is involved in making this video. He appears in it, and so do I, but I'm not getting any money out of it. But it's very good, and it takes you through the places where John Lennon grew up and the places that were significant in his story. So "Looking for Lennon," I was waiting in Australia for it to come out on TV. It's never been shown on TV in Australia, but it has in the UK and in USA. And it's sold in about 25 countries, but I think not in Australia. It's not on DVD in the UK, but it came out in DVD. This is the Italian one, which, why would you want to get an Italian one? But you have the choice when you put it on to choose Italian or English. If you click on the English one, you've got a perfect video in English, or DVD rather in English, looking for Lennon.
Now, Michael, I'd just like to ask you, you saw the Beatles, the Raw Beatles, in 1961 at the Cavern, a lunchtime session, and this is before Brian Epstein became their manager. Can you just tell everyone there how exciting and what it was like to actually see the Raw Beatles?
Well, I think the word raw is operative because they were, they looked tremendous. They were all in the leathers, the pants, the jackets, and they were really playing really pure rock and roll numbers, not ballads, and they were really belting it out. And Pete Best was a drummer, a good drummer for a rock and roll group. And looking back, it's almost like there were two groups. They changed the drummer, and of course Brian Epstein changed the group. Probably he needed to change them in order to get them to the bigger audience, the global audience that he eventually found for them. But to become a recording group, because they really became more of a recording group, they played concerts, but most people couldn't hear the music anyway at the concerts because of the screaming, so they weren't really enjoying that. But the early days, that's why they made such a tremendous impact on Liverpool, and I think Liverpool saw them in the raw rock and roll. It was pretty impressive looking back. What I could mention here, and I only discovered this literally about 2 weeks ago. I'm writing another book at the moment, mainly for my own pleasure and for my own family, which is the story of my own life. When the Beatles came back from Liverpool, they got a contract to play at the Cavern Club lunchtime, so I went with another guy who'd been at school with us. So we're both working around the corner in the city, so we're both working for insurance companies. So we turn up at the Cavern Club in our suits and ties, and of course John Lennon and the group, they're playing there in their leathers, black leathers, and we felt ancient. We were like age 20, but the audience was mostly 14 and 15-year-old girls who were supposed to be at school and somehow got off school, and so they were packing the Cavern Club. But wow, they were a dynamic group and made a huge impression. And a little while after this, of course, they were playing in Liverpool. They went back to Hamburg again, and then Brian Epstein appeared on the scene and sort of took them in hand and got them a record contract. And this was at the point I'd been working nearly 5 years in the city. I was about to go overseas with my company, and I went with a group of us, including Don Beatty from school. 4 or 5 of us who'd been at school with John. We went to see the Beatles playing at the Grafton Ballroom, and this was, they already had their first 1 or 2 records out at that point, so there was a big audience there in the ballroom, and we got to speak to John Lennon. They came off stage during the intermission, and Brian Epstein hadn't completely cleaned them up at this point, so they were still smoking on stage. And John was smoking, and he was singing, because he used to sing this, he didn't sing Long Tall Sally. He used to sing Twist and Shout. That was his sort of hollering rock and roll number. So he came and spoke to us in the intermission, and he could hardly talk. His voice was really shot. But anyway, we wished him well, and that sadly was the last time I ever saw the Beatles. I then worked overseas for 6 years. And that was a whole period when the Beatlemania was running around the world. And the time I came back, they'd stopped performing, so I never did see them in a big audience in a big stadium. But I look back, you never forget something like that. And I look back and treasured the memories that I had of John, and all of which are in the book. This is my office in Melbourne, where I wrote the book John Lennon, the Boy Who Became a Legend, and actually typed it all word by word, using Word, and I guess it took me about 3 years to write the book and about another 2 years to finally get it published. And people who want to get hold of the book, the way to get it is from the book's website. And the website is just the name of the book. So the website is one word, John Lennon Legend, johnlennonlegend.com. And you get a signed first edition copy of the book. It can also be bought on Amazon, but then you don't get Amazon print their own books, so you don't get the signed copy. Okay? If you want to know John Lennon, you need to read this book. So you get it from johnlennonlegend.com. Thanks, Plastic. A pleasure talking with you.